But I think that what you're here to see is all about, and I'm really fascinated to see this. I had a nightjar in my garden during COVID. Have I mentioned this to anybody? I'll hear about it again. So I'm fascinated to hear all about nightjar migration and movements. Dr. Greg Conway.
Introduction. The harnesses are quite good actually. We have used a whole variety of things in the past which do actually look like some of those. We did find some better options for wild gulls. Right, looks like we've got a battery change. There'll be a lot of changing, I can tell you that. Okay, so I'm Greg Conway from BTO. We've been working on nightjars for 15 or so years now, mostly in Thetford Forest, but we have done this work across Europe with various other collaborators, which will feature some of the work here. So today's talk won't just be about migration, but we'll also look at the movements on the breeding season. So we'll start with a little look at their biology, what nightjars are, what they do, and then we'll move on to some knowledge gaps, and then some of the movement work that we've done. Okay, so Galladian is advancing things. So this is a nightjar. This one we fitted with a GPS tracker. As Brian mentioned, that we're always like sort of pushing the boundaries of what birds we can track with technology. And only until about 10 years ago, the device became small enough to actually put on nightjars. So the device here is an archival GPS tag. This sits on the bird, on a little backpack, and the bird goes off, does its thing, either in breeding season or off to Africa. It basically stores information all the way it goes, and it's a bit like your mobile phone. It's got the GPS chip in it, it will take really accurate locations, store them all up, and then we've got to get it back the following year. So as we'll see in a moment, catching nightjars is tricky, and the best of times of recapturing them is even trickier. Okay. So, something you never noticed about nightjars, something you sort of really associate with woodcock is the eyes sticking out the side of the head with their 360 vision, but obviously nightjars sit on the ground, they've got to be vigilant for predators, and having that ability to see what's coming behind them is very fortunate if there's a fox lurching on top of you. So it's just not an angle you really see at nightjars, but they're just superbly adapted to their sort of conditions and using their camouflage, as we'll see in a few more examples. And the other sort of feature that nightjar's got, which is quite unusual in British birds, is pectinated claw. So it's got this little sort of comb on it. Again, the jury's still out on what the actual purpose is for this, whether it is to comb the whiskers to sort of keep them clear of insect remains and the like. But it is a feature that pretty much all nightjars do have. So it's just an odd little feature. And this is the nightjar, and it's nesting habitats as a bird on its nest, and they're just superbly camouflaged. They just blend in the background, so the bits of buff look like bits of dead wood, the plumage looks like bits of dead bracken, dead leaves, and it pretty much is invisible. And they rely on that for camouflage. They'll just stay put, only move if something's within about a metre of them. So they're really are well adapted to their environment. And the other thing with nightjars is they are these sort of nocturnal species, or sort of crepuscular species, most active at dawn and dusk, but they are quite driven in their life cycle by the moon cycle. So there is some evidence that they do tend to coincide the egg laying with the full moon, and that tends to then generally relate to the chicks hatching at the next new moon. Interestingly, insects are most abundant when the moon isn't around, they're more visible, so they tend to avoid the full moons. But nightjars have adapted to coincide with the full moon because they've got the extra light and a few insects around are much easier for them to catch. Okay, and we'll move on to what they eat as well. So moth is a very big component of nightjar diet, and there is the beetles as well. But just mentioning passing that moth populations are in quite substantial decline across all of England, so that is a worry for nightjar, which is a moth specialist. So we know that could be a potential limitation in the future. And then coming on to the other sort of aspect really, which is the migration. So they breed across much of Europe, right into sort of western Russia, around the Mediterranean, and their wintering areas then in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, this map is, it's only about 10 years old, most up-to-date one we've got, but it really reflects where the birds are observed in Africa. So it's really relying on people finding them, or people catch them. But again, with these nocturnal species, we have very little idea of exactly where they go, or which populations for Europe go to which parts of Africa, which is one of the things we're investigating at the moment. Okay. So just to show a bit of the plumage, this is a rather nice splendid male nightjar, the white spots in the wings and the tail. This little pointer doesn't work, does it? Okay, good, use that please. Okay. So the other thing about this one, we've got a few little white spots in the wing. It's quite interesting where this bird was nesting over subsequent years and subsequent families. We did find its offspring and other individuals with these little white spots. So it seems like that local sort of happening related to related individuals and being perpetuated. And then we come on to the female, and she's pretty much similar to the male, the same set of plumage, but then without the spots. It's got little buffy spots in the wings and the tail. And we know the tails themselves, they're quite spectacular things really. So the males use these white spots to flash the females to attract their attention whilst it's wing flapping. The older the males get, the whiter and brighter the spots get as well. This one's got a little bit of grubbiness here, but this bird's probably at least 2 or 3 years old. And then the female tail is broadly similar, but again with some slightly less obvious spots. And obviously the female's incubating at the nest, so it doesn't need to be, or doesn't want to be discovered. So it looks as inconspicuous as possible. Okay, and we've got any riggers here. Any hands up? Yeah. So, why is this bird a thirsty then? Anyone willing to have a stab at it? Yep, so we've got a very nice little lobe in it here. So this is the feather here, which is much shorter, much more warm, with a little buffy tip. So that is a feather that grows as a juvenile, and that's been retained on its journey down to Africa and back again. So we know this bird is exactly 1 year old. So it's really useful to have these kids, and that gives a good idea of the population structure. Some of these are quite obvious, others are not so obvious, but well spotted. Okay. So going back to the population itself, so as we know, you've got some very good sites around here, Ashdown Forest, the Wilton Heaths and Thames Basin Heaths. We've got very good populations of nightjar. In the past, the nightjar population was quite high. Back in the early BTO breeding atlas, we had about 4,500 pairs. Subsequently, the population dropped quite sharply down to the 1981 National Survey across Britain, and gradually the numbers have sort of crept up since then. At this low point, it was a major focus of conservation activities, and lots of heath management and reserve management has really sort of provided lots of habitat to turn the species fortunes around, and also with more clear felling of forests has really helped. But although the population has increased quite considerably, and the next few slides, note that. If you look at the distribution and change, again coming back to the BTO atlas maps, it's really quite apparent that these little black arrows are where the species has been lost since the late 1960s. So Ireland have pretty much vanished from, lots of central southern England have disappeared, a few strongholds down here in the south, New Forest, and again the Thames Basin, Wilton Heath, Forest, and a few others. A few little increases, but generally it's a picture of extreme range loss. And if we go to the next sort of demonstration. So the early atlas, right back here in the 60s, we had very high occupation across the whole of Britain and quite a bit of Ireland. But although the population has increased moderately since the 1980s, the range is still vastly below where it was historically. So there is still work to do to create new habitat to get them back onto new sites and additional sites. Okay. So coming on to the set of tracking as well now. So we go to the next slide. So what we'll look at is a knowledge gap. So we know in Thetford Forest we had a population of about 420 pairs back in the late 1990s. That's at the point when the site was designated for the species. And since then the population has dropped down to about 280. So it's a massive decline in a real hot spot for the species where we've got lots of habitat. So you've got these little clear fells mixed in amongst all the So yeah, little clear fells mixed in where they nest. So we've got lots of nesting habitat, and the population was doing quite well. So we want to understand what's happening. So obviously they need nesting habitat where they can put their nests, that's fine. So they have to go to even further. And then obviously the food availability is another issue. So the moth declines, there's potentially less food around. They do feed on beetles as well. So how do they access the food? Which moth do they go for is the other big question, which is important to them. And then again the migration as well. So we have a number of ideas that the birds from Britain might go to the western part of Africa, which is pretty typical of most other migrant birds, but really we have no idea at all. So our birds go pretty much anywhere in the western part, or even down to the eastern or southern part of Africa. Okay, just skipping to the next one. So if we just skip through these very quickly, Adrian. So we came up with a study then designed in Deptford Forest to look at Dersian Bog. So Dersian Bog's got a population of nightjars about 10 times more dense and greater than Deptford Forest. So we assumed that there must be something different about the foraging prospects there. We know it's rich in insects, so we assumed the density of insects was what's driving that difference. So we're doing sort of quite a bit of comparison. In terms of the habitat as well, we know that both sites have a little bit of grass and habitat, which could well be important. So we really want to understand what they were using, where they're going to forage. And once you understand what nightjars really need in terms of both nesting habitat and foraging habitat, you can then plan the actual conservation measures to provide that another habitat, so to try and reverse this population decline, this range decline. Okay, so Dersian and Thetford, so Thetford in the centre of East Anglia, Dersian, again, so quite close to the Norfolk state actually, ironically, which is on the doorstep actually. Both two important sites in East Anglia. So there's quite a lot going on there, so a combination of things. We do population monitoring pretty much every year in a subset of the forest and at Dersian as well, so we count the males, so we get an idea of the population size every year, which is important to know, because that does vary with weather and other factors. And quite a lot of intensive nest monitoring as well to understand what the productivity of the nightjars is like, and also where the adults come back to nest year on year, how site faithful they are. And then that's backed up with lots of ringing of the nestlings, so we can track where they come back to the following years, and also the adults, and that's combined then with the high resolution GPS tracking. Okay, so nest finding is quite tricky, so we've got these clear fells of Thetford Forest are vast. I mean, there's quite a few hectares here, filled with a few young trees and sort of knee-high, sort of chest-high grass and the like. So for this, we just skip through these. So it might seem like quite a basic method. We'll go out to surveys, we'll get an idea of where the birds are to start with. And then we'll go in there and we'll walk a focal area where we suspect the nest is, and usually we can find nests then in about 10 or 15 minutes. I'll come back with some minute Ken, he came out to help us. Improved things quite considerably since the early days. But with this Ecologist approach, we can find them quite easily. We don't use thermal images, basically because of this habitat. This is a tall bracken, it's chest high, knee high bracket. The thermal images don't penetrate it, so we've got to use like more basic methods. This is a nest map on that day. So it's a single egg, pretty much on the bare ground. Okay. Okay. So I can control what's even better now. Thanks very much. So nightjars, we do the catching. It's got to be done in the evening. So most of our work doesn't start until the sunset. We use a combination of methods. Mist netting is our third method, and we use that with a decoy of the bird sometimes, and then play back at the call, and that tends to attract the wind to the decoy and get caught in the net. And we also put nets up around nests, so very careful with nests, we don't overly disturb them. But catching the adults at nest once the chicks are very small is good, once the eggs are hatched. That's a really good, safe way, and for us a really good way of catching them because we know where the adults will be. And we also ring a few of the chicks. We catch a few other species, like woodcock, that we'll come back to again in a moment, again quite a declining species. And oddly enough, long enough, the other species of owl we've ever caught in a nightjar working 15 odd years in the forest, despite all the tens of tories around there. So going back to the summer habitat use, so this is a bird now with a different type of GPS tracker on it. It's the same sort of setup, but we just put a temporary fixing on the tail. So this is only going to stay fitted for a few weeks, and then the device will come off before it goes to migrate. This will bring back a few memories of Ken as well here, and Linda, who came out to help us. So we spent ages wandering around these forests trying to find nests, and I think on that occasion we didn't find any. But the nest was right next to the track in some really dense, tall trees, about twice the height of your head. Not where we'd expect to find them at all. But to give an example of the data itself, so we've got the nest site here, and the yellow bits are just ones that have moved every 5 minutes. The birds are making movements. So it comes off the nest, it's an investigation area here, so it's gone back, investigation area here. So you can see we've got lots and lots of data very rapidly. And interestingly, these areas where the birds have spent a bit of time were places where we did subsequently find nests. So if we'd known that beforehand, we'd been a lot better off. But it's one of those things you sort of live and learn as you work with these species. So the tracking work is quite interesting, that we can sort of track birds over multiple nights, so these devices stay on for about a week, and the different colours there represent different tracks, each of 2 different nests here, and it's really interesting to see these birds have, sort of come off the nest, made a very rapid movement down to these grassy heath areas and back again, regardless of distance to the edge of the forest. So that then tells us that the birds are not getting everything they need from the actual forest itself. And similarly at Dursley and Bog, with the same sort of pattern, the birds are nesting in the heath. If anyone's been to Dursley and Bog, it's sort of riddled with sort of midges and sort of biting things which are all around these sort of wet pools. And that's where we expected all our birds to be feeding. We've got a really high resource of food which is easy to collect and right on the doorstep, but they just ignore that. Go off to these fairly intense arable fields or around these sort of horse paddocks, which is not what we expected at all. There's a few more examples there, that distances involved as well. So we also thought that with the higher food resources, the birds would be nesting closer to the site. And that's partly true. So most of these nightly foraging flights are around an average of about 1 kilometre from the nest. So they do that first thing in the evening to go and feed up, and then again last thing in the night time. And comparing that to Thetford, we do find then that the distances in Thetford are about twice as much as Dursley, so we think there's partly an issue with access to the foraging sites. The birds, in all these cases, come off the forest to forage. And the consistency of foraging is quite interesting as well, that these birds come off every night and they pretty much go to the same locations within a few metres, so that gives us an indication that when they're going back to those sites, there must be some foraging hotspots there, something really good, or lots of food to catch, or very easy to catch, and that gives them a good clue then where they're going and what they're feeding on. Another spin-off from that is that we can obviously track the movements of these birds over a night. This is an unpaired male early in the breeding season, and he's been hanging around over an area about 4 or 5 kilometres. And if you look at the places this bird has gone, each of these clear fells, when we're doing surveys, we have people stationed about a kilometre apart in each of these clear fells counting the birds, and that bird could have been counted 5 times. So that gives us a bit of an insight to when we're trying to calculate population estimates, to be aware that these unpaired birds are very mobile and can overinflate your population estimate. And again, this bird still goes off the heath to feed between times as well. And then at Rhymestone, we do the odd birds that do really odd things that we don't expect them to do. So this is the nesting in the Thetford Forest. It's quite happily there for like 2 or 3 days after we tagged it. Then it just heads off the north, around the top of the forest, right up to the Norfolk coast. Spends an evening there, and then just sets out over the North Sea. Spends a whole evening right out. I mean, this is like 40, 50 kilometres. It's not like just a little detour. Comes back in then around Great Yarmouth, spends a couple of days there, and eventually gets back to the forest, and then we catch it a couple of days later. I mean, these sort of movements are just not really things we think about for birds, which are on breeding territories, they're nesting established with young, in most cases. But it does give a bit of hope really for a lot of species that they have this exploratory aspect where they can go off, they can find new habitats and recolonise, which is really good from a conservation perspective. But we've had a few records of nightjar doing similar things, one which went from Yorkshire right down to Cambridge almost, within breeding season. So coming back then, trying to link the breeding sites with the wintering sites, the migration is the interesting bit. So again, we've got the breeding range here in the north of Europe and into Asia, and then these areas down in Africa where we suspect they're wintering. So again, we suspect the birds from Western Europe would go to the western part of Africa, that's the logical thing. The birds further south go the shortest distance, and they seem to be quite parallel, but we just don't know until we start tagging. We can get birds going to all parts of Africa. So from ringing data, I mean, nightjars are a species we never see, we can't observe it, so putting rings on birds is useful, but because nightjar have got very good camouflage, they're just not species that get spanned very much, they don't find on roads. So our data on movements is very much limited to within Britain and a little bit of migration route down to Africa, but beyond that we knew nothing. So that's where the technology started to come in. So in these early years, back in these mid-2000s, geolocation became available and just became small enough to use on nightjar. So these give us very coarse locations, so accurate to within a few hundreds of kilometres or 500 kilometres, but very good for tracking migration at this continental scale. And this is work by Brian Kerscall at Biotrack and Dorset, tracked 2 birds down to the Democratic Republic of Congo, interestingly both outside of what we expected to be the wintering range. So that's that part of the story, and as we can see, the technology moved on quite rapidly. This is the early one that Brian used, and the device got smaller and more compact, which we used then in a follow-up study at 2010. So that's the best option we had available. But then the technologies moved on, the GPS tags became available, and then we used them subsequently. So we used did a couple of sets of analysis with both sets of tags. So the first one, which is based on geolocated data, we sort of teamed up with some other workers in Belgium. And again, all with tracking studies, it's a lot of effort to capture birds, recapture them. So the only way to get a good representation of where these birds go is to pull studies across Europe. And doing that really gives you good insight into where these birds go. They make a rapid journey down to the Mediterranean, they might stop in North Africa, and then make a big hop down across the Sahara, and then eventually get to the wintering areas south of the equatorial forest. So interestingly, we thought this area on the equator, the forest, which is really teeming with insect life, which is packed full of nightjars, but no, they just avoid that. It's probably just too dense and they just don't feed there. So departing sort of late August, early September, about 7,000 kilometre journey, getting down to the wintering areas by early November. So we spent a few months there, and then they start heading back up again in spring, so it's pretty much similar, but you will notice the birds are much further over to the west. So departing to late February time, and the distance is quite considerable, so birds don't make such a big distance movement unless there's a good reason to. So the migration is a much narrower front, but we have got this really concentrated area, all these birds ending up in this very sort of western corner of Africa. So we think the birds are just feeding up there with the seasonal rains, when there's another abundance of insect life, and that gives them the resource they need to make a rapid journey across the Sahara and back up then to Britain to their breeding grounds. So with the GPS tracks, so that was the geolocators, which is very cool, so we can now sort of track these birds in much more detail. We've got more data coming back all the time, but we've got a nice sample of 9 returning birds. And this is a very sort of brief overview map, which all these wintering locations are outside the recognised wintering areas. And then the interesting aspect as well, that the birds go back in the spring and they all concentrate here. And these locations will sort of limit down to sort of, a few tens of metres. So our UK birds are outside the known wintering zone, which is really interesting. But knowing that birds are concentrated there, we know if anything does happen in that part of Africa to the habitats or sort of droughts and the like, that could have a detrimental effect on our nightjar population and help us monitor future change or understand future change. But the area in pink here is really quite startling, that this is an area where birds do stop to put on resources. And this is pretty common for other species such as cuckoos, you've probably seen from the BTO tracking work, and also swifts and a number of other species. They all stop in this area before then they've got a nice sort of journey back up to Britain. And just to show some examples of what we get from the individual GPS tracks, this one example. So this is the actual route, exact route is taken to within a few tens of metres. We can then start to look at the stopovers, so we can see it leaves in mid-September, hops across the channel, so it stops on the north side of the channel for a bit, a couple of days, hops across a couple of days, down to the Pyrenees, where it makes a slightly more extended stop, and then quite a rapid journey then over a couple of weeks, across the Sahara, stops to build up resources again, and then a couple more stops down to the wintering areas. And we can then start to zoom in on these as well, so we come back to this bird leaving the breeding area, so it's had its nest around here. Goes off to a bit of feeding throughout August and September, then on the 18th of September it heads off. This is just over Centre Parks, and these quite big steps night by night, so 300-400 kilometres at a time. It's mostly moving at these points in time and gets it down to the Pyrenees. And then we can see the birds that have got down to this sort of area of quite intensive agriculture, a nice scrubby hillside, and just homed in on this area down here for a few minutes. Just zoom into that. We can see it's like a little bit of extensive habitat within the agricultural field, so it's property rich in moths would have stayed and re-roosted on the hillside. Unfortunately, that tag didn't progress much further than that, although we didn't catch it back the next year. So that just gives a really good insight into looking exactly which trees these birds are using in Africa. So just in conclusion. But anyway, in conclusion, that we understand a lot more now that nightjar nesting habitat is fine, but we do need to provide the feeding habitat to go with that complementary. So in forest systems, it does need an element of grassland nearby. And with those wintering areas as well, that's not where we expected them to be. And that's just interesting as well. With GPS data now, we have really good tracks on how the birds get there and back, which routes they take, and that will give us a bit of insight into what problems they might face with illegal hunting. If the birds are really concentrated in spring, that's not good, so that does make them more vulnerable. But that has, taken on leaps and bounds really from what we knew just 10 years ago, and that work will continue with subsequent tracking work. So I'll end there, and I'll just very briefly come to another night evening bird. So we've got a national survey for woodcock coming up. So this is a species where we need a lot of help to cover the ground to repeat the survey. So a bit of background, we've been monitoring a subset of sites since 2003. As you can see, the population has sort of declined. We have had the national surveys at intervals of 03 and 13, but between these surveys we can see we've got a very sort of prolonged decline, which is a major concern. The species is now red listed because of its range decline, breeding range in Britain, which has dropped by over 50% in 30 years. And more recently, for the national surveys, the numbers have dropped from 78,000, and that's just a 30% decline in 10 years. So the survey coming up this year is very important to see where that population has got to now. Obviously, it's a species that's more concerned because there is shooting the species still, and there is, there's a risk of these birds being shot in winter do include some of our breeding birds. So we really want to understand how that breeding population has changed. So we really would appreciate your help with that. So you can see David and Helen at the BTO desk, or just log on to the BTO website to see where you can access the site or map the site. And across the county, really, we've got plenty of sites. The red ones are retaken, but we've got lots of yellow ones which we covered in the previous year, previous survey, which we'd like to get resurveyed. And there are quite a lot of other ones which will become available later. So please speak to David and Helen about that. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Lovely, thank you. Isn't it astonishing what these GPSs and geolocators are doing these days? It's mind-blowing. I don't know whether I'm to be more impressed with what we do or the nightjars do. Nightjars, let's go with nightjars. Okay, we've got some time for some questions. Yes, let's start. Any monitoring studies been done on the Ashdown?
I'm not best placed to answer that. I don't know if Helen's got any insight for Dave? Or...
survey done in 2010, BTO organised survey
Okay.
So Ashdown will be surveyed this year.
Okay.
Okay, so Ashdown will be surveyed this year, and one was done in 2010, just in case you didn't pick that up. Any more questions? Oh, at the back.
Is there anything that can be done if forest is clear felled before the trees really grow up to improve the habitat for nightjars and maybe woodcock? Anything simple that landowners can do?
Anything that landowners can do before clear fell to improve the habitat
After
after clear fell to improve the woodcock and nightjar.
It's a tricky one, really, because most forest systems wait about 40 years before they clear fell. The trees have got to be a commercial sort of age or sort of timber yield to be worthwhile. The trouble with forest management now is they've steered away from clear fell management, where they basically clear large blocks of forest, which then subsequently get replanted and grow up, and they're really good. That's where most of our nightjars are, and even some of the woodcock. But the key is to try and maintain that initial sort of growth stage, really, where you have got pockets of bare ground and pockets of young vegetation. I mean, the work that GWCT is doing at the moment is trying to look at woodland management, so it's more of a sort of coppice type system where you create these different age categories, sort of open habitat, as well as some sort of young growth. In commercial forest systems, it's more of a headache because it's easier to do large blocks, but now as large blocks aren't going, it's more of a continental style of management. They take out a few big trees and leave smaller blocks, which isn't so good for nightjar, but probably would benefit woodcock. But that is something we're looking at with Forestry England and the forestry companies to see what can be done to at least put some suitable breeding habitats back into places now that clear felling is in fashion. So we are looking at it, but it's not a good, the change in clear felling isn't necessarily that good for woodcock and nightjar.
I think the beetle infestation on spruce, for example, is leading to some quite large areas being felled in Sussex.
Yes, and yes, certainly in infected forested places that have got issues with other sort of tree diseases and large areas have been felled. I mean, so it is beneficial for a short time, but it's having that continuity of habitat, which is the key thing that needs to be designed in forest plans. And in most forest plans with nightjar interest, it is almost a condition in some cases to provide a certain amount of clear fell year on year, so there's that continuity. We don't end up with everything growing up and the birds just having nowhere to go.
Okay.
So do the nightjars migrate at night or during the day?
Do they migrate at night or during the day?
Yes and no. So effectively at night, yeah, so basically birds will fly overnight, and that's where they do most of their migration. In the daytime they will stop down and roost if they can. The exceptions are obviously birds crossing the Mediterranean, so there's quite a few sort of documented cases now where birds obviously crossing the Mediterranean, got nowhere to go, so they're forced to fly through the daytime. And quite a few observations and even some of the tracking data showing that birds have limits of flying in the daytime to make that crossing. But generally they do that under cover of darkness. They don't fly in the daylight unless they really have to, or they've got to get across a desert or an ocean.
Did I mention I had a nightjar in my garden? I had the pleasure of watching it during the day, and some people who were here came round to the garden to see it. It landed in a spruce tree in my garden in the middle of Lansing, and I had the pleasure of watching it at dusk, as it had sat there absolutely motionless all day, and then at dusk it opened an eye, and then I was really pleased to see it had to stretch. It had to really stretch before it set off, and then it was just gone in a moment. We've got another question at the back that was a yes.
Yes, if there's a very cold spell, for example, I know shooting of wildfowl is usually stopped for a while. With the decline of the woodcock population, is that likely to get to a point at which there will be a consideration of stopping shooting?
Okay, so that's with the decline in the woodcock population. Is there likely to be a point where there'll be a cessation of shooting?
There are a couple of questions there. The first one in respect of hard weather. So there is a voluntary ban which comes in, I think it's after 10 days, is it, Ryan? Yeah, of freezing conditions. So that's brought in to stop all wildfowl being disturbed and other wading species as well. And that becomes next statutory after 20 days, or around 20 days. So that is already in place just to prevent sort of undue disturbance and detrimental effects to wildfowl and waders. The main reason this national survey is important is that once we understand how much the population has dropped, there are obviously calls for a curtailment of the shooting season, so that is a petition being put to the government, which will be assessed based on the results of this national survey. So the sooner we have some hard data which tells us how the population has changed, that will then sort of basically steer the decisions about what happens to woodcock and whether there is a curtailment or even possibly a cessation of shooting to protect the British population. So at the moment we don't know, but once we have the results we'll be able to put that forward to policy makers.
Oh, yes, Audrey.
With the possibility of everyone planting more and more trees, most of the birds that you're talking about are woodland species. Is this going to improve the situation or make things worse when we've got more trees?
So with more and more tree planting due to happen, will this make this better for woodland species or not?
Again, it's not as initially yes but a no. It's all about planting trees, but both woodcock and nightjar need bare ground. That's a key component of the habitat. They need that sort of open, bare area or sort of young growth. So it's having like a coppice system is probably the best option, where you have got a mixture of mature trees, younger trees, and then planted trees. But just letting woodland grow up, that's part of the problem, that once it gets mature, certainly nightjar can't get into it once it's 20 years old, or 15 or 20 years old. Woodcock might persist a bit better in open woodland, but it does need